Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with Lecture 9, which I'm afraid is going to be rather lengthier than usual because not only do we need to cover the domestic policies of President Woodrow Wilson, we also need to talk about U.S. involvement in World War I. Of course, at the time, people didn't know there was going to be a World War II, so they didn't call the war World War I. Instead, they simply called it the Great War because it was by far the greatest and most terrible war in human history up to that point in time. Well, a little bit of background on Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a Southerner. He was born in Virginia in 1856. His family later moved to North Carolina. And this fact about Wilson was very crucial in his development as a person. In fact, he later said that his very first memory was as a 4-year-old child hearing that Abraham Lincoln had been elected president and that there was soon to be a civil war. So he grew up in the shadow of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Redemption in the South. He went to the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and obtained a PhD in political science, making him the only president in American history ever to have a PhD. Later, he got a job teaching at Princeton University in New Jersey and became the president of Princeton University, after which he was elected governor of New Jersey. Another very important factor about Wilson, besides his southernness, was his religion. Wilson was raised in a very strict Presbyterian family, and it isn't so much true nowadays, but at that time Presbyterians strictly followed the theology of the 16th century religious leader John Calvin. And I just want to pick on a couple of points about Calvin's theology that were very significant for Wilson. First of all, Calvinists believed that God had chosen before time began and before any of us were born, who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell. This theory is called predestination, the idea that God predestines some people to heaven and some people to hell. The other important Calvinist idea that Wilson really believed in was the idea of covenant. And if you think about the Old Testament in the Bible, there are several occasions when God makes a covenant with humanity. He does this with Noah when he puts the rainbow in the sky and promises to not destroy the world again. He makes a covenant with Moses. He makes a covenant with Abraham. What is a covenant? Well, it's simply an agreement between God and humanity, in which God promises to bless the world and human beings promise to obey God. And Calvinists believed that every nation should make a covenant with God. Woodrow Wilson embraced this idea very much and even extended it to include the entire world. So as he's trying to create the League of Nations, as we'll see, what he's really trying to do is to get all humanity to make a covenant, an agreement with God, and to create a new world order that way. How did predestination come into it? Well, in Wilson's life, predestination, the idea that he was predestined to go to heaven, gave him a great deal of confidence. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson was convinced that he was a man destined by God for greatness. And this sense of his really helped convince him that he was right about nearly everything, and that he was the man God had appointed to lead the world at a crucial time in history. In terms of American politics, Wilson was very much a follower of Thomas Jefferson in a number of ways. First of all, Jefferson believed that the most important people in American society were farmers. and that it was necessary to promote farming and landowning if you wanted to increase the good qualities of the citizens and the virtues of the people so that the republic would last. And this view of Wilson's made it natural for him to join the Democratic Party. Of course, most Southerners and pretty much all Southern white farmers in the early 20th century were Democrats. Okay. Also, Wilson believed, with Thomas Jefferson, that it was necessary from time to time for nations to experience revolution in order to sweep away corruption and establish justice. And this belief led Wilson to support revolutions in other countries, particularly in Mexico, as we shall see. Finally, Wilson very much believed in Jefferson's idea of natural rights as he expressed it in the Declaration of Independence, that human beings have certain rights that come from God, the Creator, including the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. Now, Wilson believed in this concept so passionately that he made it his goal to promote natural rights in America, at least for white American citizens, and also around the entire world. So, in a sense, he wants to export the American Revolution to the whole world so that all citizens of the world will enjoy the kind of rights that we enjoy in this country. However, as I hinted just a moment ago, Woodrow Wilson didn't extend the full range of civil rights to all American citizens. He was, to put it bluntly, a racist. And this was part of the reason why Wilson really was in favor of having a small federal government. At least at first, he favored a small federal government and very powerful state governments because it was the states, after all, that had passed the Jim Crow laws. And so Wilson wanted to protect those discriminatory laws against black people at the state level. And so, at least at first, he wanted the federal government to be less powerful than the states. Now, the depth of Woodrow Wilson's racism you get a sense of from the quote on the right hand side of the screen. And this quote is from the movie The Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915 during Wilson's administration, that we're going to watch part of during this module and have a discussion about. This was an incredibly popular movie. It was the first great epic film. It's also an extremely racist and offensive film. And the quote here, you see Wilson wrote in his History of the United States, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan." So you see that Wilson was even very much in favor of the KKK and the role it played in terrorizing black inhabitants of the South and promoting white supremacy. And Wilson also promoted white supremacy and segregation in the federal government. After he became president, he found that under Roosevelt and Taft, 17 African Americans had been appointed to good jobs in the federal government at the supervisory level. And Wilson promptly fired 15 out of those 17 black employees and then proceeded to segregate the U.S. Post Office and Treasury Departments. For all these reasons, African Americans felt betrayed by Woodrow Wilson, particularly an African American newspaper editor named William Monroe Trotter, who wrote in his newspaper that Wilson was creating, quote, "a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens," end quote, playing off Wilson's slogan, "the new freedom." And then, shortly thereafter, Trotter went to the White House to talk to Wilson, and Wilson considered Trotter's conduct to be so uppity and so rude that he actually had Trotter escorted out of the White House, and they never met again. So you see that racism was very much a part of Woodrow Wilson's belief system. Um, and it's interesting, though, that after he actually became president, Wilson seemed to forget about his states' rights views because, after all, he was the president now, the head of the federal branch of government, the federal level of government, and he wanted power at that level so that he could make changes in society. And so he tended to move much more strongly towards wanting a strong central government after he became president. And he used that power for a lot of progressive reforms. He was a true progressive in many ways. And so, once again, you see here that progressivism could and often did go hand in hand with racism. One of Wilson's progressive reforms, he created the Federal Reserve Board, very important government body that regulates our economy and determines our money supply at any given moment. Also, in the same year, 1913, Wilson got Congress to pass and the states to ratify the 16th Amendment, which for the first time made the income tax legal in peacetime. So every year on April 15th, as we turn in our income tax returns, we have Woodrow Wilson to thank for that. And of course, this increased the power of the federal government because it gave the federal government a lot more revenue. In 1914, Congress, with Wilson's approval, passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act and closed the loopholes in it so that from that point forward it was used strictly against giant corporations' monopolies and not against labor unions as had happened earlier. In 1914 also, Congress created the Federal Trade Commission as part of the federal government. The Federal Trade Commission's job is to monitor business, to stop unfair business practices, also to keep an eye on trusts and monopolies, and to protect the rights of consumers. So very, very much in keeping with progressive reform as we've seen. Finally, in 1916, Wilson proposed and Congress accepted that federal employees should get workers' comp. So not all employees in the country, but at least those who worked for the federal government got workers' comp starting in 1916. Furthermore, Wilson supported a law that was passed in 1916 by Congress called the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. Now, this was the first comprehensive attempt to deal with the problem of child labor. And what this law did was to say that if a factory was using child labor, that its products could only be sold within the state where that factory was located. They could not be sold across state lines. Now, obviously, this would have diminished the use of child labor quite a bit if it had continued. However, the Supreme Court stepped in and struck down this law, declaring it unconstitutional because the court said, according to the Constitution, Congress only had power over interstate commerce, but really what this law was trying to do was tell manufacturers how to run their business, which was unconstitutional. So the law was struck down. Child labor continued. After that, the problem of controlling child labor fell to the state governments, and their solution usually was to pass laws saying that all children of a certain age had to be in school. And obviously, if they were in school, they couldn't be working in a factory. This is a little ironic, though. It's interesting that progressive reformers wanted to ban child labor primarily because they were concerned about families. But this method of dealing with the problem, putting kids in school, you can see, in a way, actually weakened the family because it took control of children for much of the day out of the hands of the parents and put it into the hands of teachers and governments that were running these schools. The use of child labor was not finally definitely banned in this country until the FDR administration in 1941. Now, I spoke earlier about Wilson's desire to promote revolution throughout the world. Um, and one great example happened in Mexico, and this Mexican fiasco really showed how little experience Wilson had in terms of foreign policy, that he was pretty much totally unprepared to deal with foreign policy as president. Um, in 1914, a revolution broke out in Mexico. The leaders of the revolution were two men named Carranza and Pancho Villa. And Wilson decided that their cause was just, and he decided to help them overthrow the Mexican government. And so he sent in the United States Marines into the city of Veracruz in Mexico. And the Marines attacked and captured that city as part of this revolution. In justifying this foreign adventure, Wilson said he wanted to promote a, quote, family of mankind devoted to the development of true constitutional liberty, end quote, very much in keeping with Jeffersonian ideals. However, this idealism began to appear quite ridiculous when the two revolutionary leaders, Villa and Carranza, fell out with each other. After which Wilson started supporting Carranza, and Villa, who was furious at the U.S., actually attacked the state of New Mexico, resulting in the United States government having to send an army into Mexico to try to catch Pancho Villa in 1916 and 1917 under General John J. Pershing. But even though Pershing chased Villa around Mexico for about a year, he never actually captured Villa. A terrible embarrassment for the United States and a real embarrassment for Wilson in terms of foreign policy. So, this disaster in Mexico really made the U.S. public very reluctant to get involved in World War I when it broke out in August 1914. And you're probably familiar with the circumstances. The war broke out because the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in southeastern Europe, whose name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, visited the region of Bosnia, where he was assassinated, and his wife was assassinated too, by a Serbian nationalist. And that led to bad blood between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Different nations in Europe took sides, and ultimately this led to the war breaking out. But the American tradition, as you know by now, had always been isolationist. We generally stayed out of European conflicts, and nearly everybody in America wanted to stay out of World War I at first. However, the Germans, who had supported Austria-Hungary and entered World War I on their side, had a new bit of naval technology called the submarine. They were the first to really use submarines effectively in warfare. They called them U-boats. And this was really a danger to the U.S. because even though the Germans promised they would not sink U.S. ships as long as we stayed out of the war, there were many, many American citizens who traveled on British ships, and the British had come into the war against Germany. And so from time to time, the German U-boats would sink British ships, and Americans would be killed as a result. The most famous example of this happened in May of 1915 when a U-boat sunk the British ship Lusitania because it suspected that this ship, even though it was a passenger ship, had weapons on board going to the front, which was actually true. So according to the laws of war, the Germans were justified in sinking the Lusitania, but it happened that there were 128 American citizens who were killed when that ship sank. And so American public opinion was outraged, and Wilson knew that he had to do something. Um, so he opened negotiations with Germany, and he actually got the Germans to make a very generous promise. Basically, the Germans said that from then on, whenever they were going to sink a passenger ship, they would warn the ship. And this was really a big concession for them to make because it meant the U boat had to surface, and it meant the captain had to get up with a megaphone and shout to the ship that it was about to be sunk and to man the lifeboats. And of course, in the meantime, if the ship was armed, it could start shooting at the U boat. So this was actually a very generous promise by the Germans. Um, and it worked to keep the U.S. out of the war for a while. I said this was the most terrible war in human history, and that had primarily to do with the new military technology that was deployed in World War One. You see some examples here: machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks even began to be used towards the end of the war. You also have airplanes being used for the first time in warfare, mostly for reconnaissance, that is, spying on the enemy. But sometimes there were what were called dogfights between aircraft on different sides. Also, in this war, kind of surprisingly, chemical weapons were used extensively by both sides. Poison gas, which meant that soldiers had to wear gas masks a lot of the time. Chemical weapons are banned today by international agreement, but during World War One they were not banned, and so many soldiers suffered from the effects of poison gas. And the net effect of all these new weapons was to make it very, very difficult for either side to mount an attack, a successful attack. So basically, the story of the war on the Western Front was that both sides settled down, they dug trenches, and stayed in those trenches for the 4 years of the war. And from time to time, one side or the other would try to attack the other side's trench, and the defenders would use their machine guns, flamethrowers, etc., to totally destroy the attack and kill massive numbers of the attacking side. You get an example of this just to give you a sense of the scale of this war. In 1916, the British decided to attack the Germans in what became known as the Battle of the Somme River. That lasted for about a month. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British sent 110,000 troops over the top into no man's land, which was the land between the trenches. And out of those 110,000 British soldiers, 60,000 were either killed or wounded, and 19,000 were killed. That was just the first day. That was just the British side. That doesn't even count the Germans. Okay? So on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, more British soldiers were killed than there have been American soldiers killed in the entire 14 years that we've been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, just to put things into perspective. Terribly, terribly destructive war. Well, when Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, his slogan was, "He kept us out of war," basically celebrating the fact that so far the U.S. had managed to stay out of World War I, and voters liked that. And many voters also liked his progressive record on a number of issues. And so Wilson helped to bring the supporters of Teddy Roosevelt, who had left the Republican Party in 1912 and formed the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. A lot of those people ended up in the Democratic Party because of Wilson's progressive record, which really strengthened the Democrats. However, Wilson's slogan did not remain true for long, because by January 1917, the war had been dragging on, both sides were near exhaustion, And the Germans were desperate for any kind of edge that would help lead them to victory. And so in January 1917, Germany announced that it was going to once again start attacking um, ships, passenger ships, indiscriminately without giving a warning. At about the same time, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Minister Alfred Zimmermann that was addressed to the Mexican government. And what this telegram said was that if the U.S. got into the war, and if Mexico agreed to attack the United States, that Germany would support Mexico in that attack. Um, and so the British told the White House, and the White House released the Zimmermann telegram to the newspapers. And Americans were absolutely furious. For the first time, totally furious with the Germans for threatening to help Mexico attack our country and win back a lot of the territory we had taken from them back in the Mexican War that ended in 1848. So by April of 1917, Wilson felt he really had no choice but to lead the United States into war with Germany. So he went to Congress on April 2nd of that year and made a very famous speech declaring that the U.S. was at war with Germany. The most famous line from this speech came when Wilson was explaining why the U.S. was entering the war on the side of Britain and France. He said that our goal was not to support the kingdoms of Europe. Our goal was to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote. So, again, you see here Wilson's idealism that he hoped the war would result in the spread of American democracy throughout the world. And a lot of progressives also embraced the idea of the war because they felt that it was an opportunity for the federal government to get bigger and more centralized and to exert control over more areas of American life, as always happens in wartime. There were some observers who were skeptical about this. One journalist, Randolph Bourne, said, quote, "If the war is too strong for you to prevent, how is it going to be weak enough for you to control and mold to your liberal purposes?" End quote. So, in other words, Bourne is saying that war, if you're trying to use war to promote your own agenda, you're really playing with fire. War has a logic of its own, and you can't control it. You don't know where it's going to lead you. However, in spite of this, it is true that the progressives did use the war to create several new federal government agencies, including Selective Service. So, all of you young men in the class who have had to register for the draft, a possible draft someday, this is because of the Selective Service Act in World War I. Also, a War Industries Board that coordinated war production in factories for the war effort, and a food administration which was led by Herbert Hoover. This was the first time Herbert Hoover became a prominent leader in the government, and of course later he would become president, as we'll see. Also, in order to support the war effort, the government raised the income tax and used the media very effectively to try to manipulate the people into supporting the war. On the left, you see a very famous war poster calling on young American males to enlist in the army. Why? Well, you see this woman floating down or sinking down to the bottom of the sea with her child, obviously a victim of a German submarine attack on a ship that's been sunk by the German U-boats. So, very effective poster. And here are a few more posters that were used to encourage Americans to not eat as much of certain food products so that they could be used in the war effort, and also to buy U.S. government savings bonds so that the government would have better financing to carry on the war. So in every respect, the government grows and exerts more control over the American people because of the war effort. Now, in warfare, when a nation goes to war, there are always people who gain and people who lose. So let's look at who gained from World War One first of all. Um, well, people that wanted to prohibit alcohol sale and manufacturing in the U.S. Gained greatly, and for two reasons. Partly because the wheat that was used to make beer was needed for the war effort, but especially because most of the great brewers in America, if you think of Schlitz, Budweiser, um, which is part of the Anheuser-Busch company, and so forth, Pabst, these were all German Americans, and the hostility to Germans after we entered the war on the side of Britain and France was intense. And so this gave prohibition advocates good arguments for banning alcohol, they playing on this anti-German sentiment. And so they got Congress and the states to approve the 18th Amendment in 1919, which did establish prohibition until 1933. Women, too, gained, you could say, during the war because while many of the men had been drafted into the Army, armed services, someone had to do the factory jobs to make the ships and the weapons and so forth for the war effort. And so many women, for the first time, got the opportunity to go outside the home and work to have a paid employment outside the home. And even though those women, for the most part, did go back to their homes after the war was over and resumed being housewives, in recognition of the contribution that women had made to the war effort, women finally did get the vote throughout the United States in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So women gained quite a bit from the war. African Americans, too, saw an opportunity because, again, with many factory workers and other laborers away in the war effort, that meant that employers were willing to hire blacks, even those who had discriminated against African American workers before, were suddenly willing to hire blacks in these factories, most of which were in the North. And so during World War One, a huge number of African Americans, hundreds of thousands of African Americans from the South, decided to leave the South and move north to take these factory jobs. And this is the beginning of what we call the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. Some of you may have family members up north who were part of this Great Migration of blacks to the North, which went on actually for many years after World War One. However, when we look at who lost as a result of the war, in many ways, African Americans also suffered as a result of this migration because as more and more African Americans began moving into northern cities, those white workers who were left there, who were not in the war, resented that. And they really were afraid that African Americans were going to take away jobs permanently from white people. And so there were riots in many, many cities between white workers and black workers, the most famous of which took place in East St. Louis, Illinois, in the summer of 1917. Riots which left thousands of African Americans homeless and hundreds dead. But this was a widespread phenomenon throughout the country. So African Americans both gained and lost. Big losers in World War One were people that were more on the left wing of the political spectrum, the more extreme progressives, and also socialists. And public opinion really turned against them because in 1917 in Russia, a group of communists under the leadership of Lenin overthrew the Tsar of Russia, the ruler of Russia, and established a communist regime in that country. And so many Americans were afraid that the same thing might happen here. And so Wilson took a very hard line against people who he suspected of being socialists or communists. He said in one speech, quote, "Disloyalty will be dealt with the firm hand of stern repression," end quote. So basically, Wilson censored the press, took away these people's right to freedom of speech, and at one point even put a large number of communists on a boat um, without any kind of legal procedure and sent them to Russia just to get rid of them. So left wingers are losers. Also, obviously, German Americans suffered a lot during the war. In fact, because of this new anti-German hatred, many of them even changed their names during the war. So if your name before was König, let's say you were a German American, you might change it to King so that you wouldn't sound so German. And even products that were associated with Germany, like sauerkraut, got new names during the war. Sauerkraut became known as Liberty Cabbage. Dachshund dogs were called Liberty Pups. So kind of silly, but it gives you a sense of the hostility directed toward Germans during World War I in this country. And a really extreme example of that, in April 1918 in Collinsville, Illinois, a miner named Robert Prager was lynched, murdered by a mob for no other reason than that he was a German American. So German Americans, terrible suffering during this war. Well, the British and French side did win the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And you see the casualty totals there at the top left. Clearly, the United States didn't lose nearly as many men as the other belligerents because we came into the war so late. But American doughboys, that's what U.S. soldiers were called in this war, doughboys, did get involved in some important battles towards the end of the war at places named Belleau Wood, Chateau Thierry, and Saint Mihiel, and did play a key role in wrapping up the war in 1918 with victory for the Allied side. Just want to mention there were black doughboys as well, but at this point in time, the U.S. Armed Services were strictly segregated. So they had their own units, did not interact with the white soldiers very much, if at all. There were also quite a few American Indians who served in the American Expeditionary Force. That's what our military was called during this war as well. Well, one of the reasons why Wilson became enthusiastic about getting the U.S. into World War I was that he wanted to be there at the negotiating table when the war ended. Because again, he had a vision of what the world should be like after the war. And he wanted to be involved in the peace settlement. In fact, before the war even ended, in January 1918, Wilson gave a very important speech called The 14 Points, in which he laid out what he thought were the key 14 key factors in the post-war world. One was national self-determination. Wilson believed that it was time for the old-fashioned empires like Austria-Hungary to be eliminated, and for those empires to be broken up into smaller countries that would reflect the ethnic makeup of the people there. So the goal was that each ethnic group that had its own language and its own culture would get its own little country, and that this would help to promote peace. And so if you look at the map there, in fact, that was done. Austria-Hungary was broken up into smaller countries, Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia. In a way, the process didn't go far enough, as we'll see when we get to World War II, that the fact there were still Germans in Czechoslovakia, for instance, was one factor in leading to the outbreak of World War II. Another key principle, the 14 points, was disarmament. Wilson wanted countries to get rid of some of their weapons that had contributed to the war. And in fact, that did happen after the war, especially reductions in navies. Free trade, Wilson believed that commerce was a key to international peace. But finally, and above all, Wilson wanted to create a new international organization called the League of Nations, similar to our United Nations today. And it's very significant. Wilson said that the League of Nations should make a covenant among all the nations of the world to join together in this group and to promote peace. And so that word covenant very much comes out of his own religious tradition, as I mentioned earlier. Well, the war ended on November 11th, 1918, with the armistice. That was a truce that stopped the fighting. By the way, our holiday of Veterans Day started out as Armistice Day at the end of World War I. We have it in early November. And so, basically, what Wilson was trying to do was to get people to think that the war hadn't just been a disaster, that it hadn't been all futile and in vain, that some good could come out of it. If the world formed this League of Nations, it might guarantee that peace would be established and that it would last forever. And that would at least be one good result of World War I and all the destruction it caused. So the catchphrase was that World War I would become the war to end all wars. And so Wilson decided in January 1919 to do something very unusual for an American president, namely, at that time, very unusual, namely leave the country and go to the peace conference, which was held at the Palace of Versailles in France in person, and to take his idealism over there and try to win people over directly. And before he got to the conference, Wilson toured around throughout much of Europe, and everywhere he went, people turned out, massive crowds, just shouting their love for Woodrow Wilson, really treating him almost like he was a savior or a messiah. It was said that poor Italian peasants even got pictures of Wilson, and they would burn candles in front of the pictures as if he were some kind of saint. Now, this adoration with which Wilson was greeted really ticked off some of the leaders of Europe. For example, the French Prime Minister, whose name was Georges Clemenceau, said, quote, 14 points? That's a bit much. The good Lord had only 10, end quote, referring, of course, to the Ten Commandments. And the French and the British really had some reasons why they didn't want to go along with Wilson's ideas. Wilson didn't want to punish Germany for the war. You know, he felt it was essential to establishing peace to treat Germany more or less as an equal. But the French and the British had lost so many men and had spent so much money on the war that they wanted revenge, pure and simple. And so the French and British insisted in the Treaty of Versailles on Article 231, which became kind of infamous because what it said was that Germany was solely responsible for starting the war. I don't have time to go into the whole history of this, but I think anyone who looks at the history of the outbreak of World War I knows this is totally ridiculous. It wasn't Germany's fault. Nevertheless, because of this idea that Germany itself had caused the war and was guilty, in the Treaty of Versailles it says that Germany had to pay the sum of 132 billion marks, that was the German currency, in gold. They couldn't send paper money, it had to be gold. Alright? This was a huge, huge sum of money that actually the Germans did not succeed in paying off until the year 2010. Only 6 years ago, the reparations from the Treaty of Versailles finally were paid off by Germany. So Wilson lost in some ways, but he did get what he wanted in terms of the creation of the League of Nations. Um, but that meant that he had to convince the United States Senate. Before the U.S. could join the League of Nations, he had to convince the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, according to our Constitution. And it just so happened that right before the war ended, there had been an election, a congressional election in the U.S., and the Republicans had won a smashing victory. So they took control of the Senate in 1918. And many Republicans were isolationists. They hadn't been in favor of the war to begin with. And they really were afraid of the League of Nations, what the consequences might be if the U.S. joined. For instance, they were afraid that if the League of Nations decided to declare war on some country, that the U.S. would be forced to participate, whether we wanted to or not, whether Congress approved that war or not. And so they were afraid that we would lose some of our national independence to the League of Nations. So Republicans didn't really support Wilson on the League. A lot of progressives were mad at Wilson because he had locked up people who were, more liberal or left wing during the war for daring to speak out against him. So really, Wilson didn't have a whole lot of support as he tried to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations. And so Wilson decided to do another unusual thing, which was to go on a lengthy train trip throughout the country and to give as many speeches as he could in September of 1919 to try to get voters to, write their congressmen and get them to ratify the treaty. And so Wilson traveled about 10,000 miles by train. He gave 40 speeches during this whirlwind trip. By the time he got to Pueblo, Colorado, he was completely exhausted and actually in Pueblo collapsed and had to be rushed back to the White House, where on October the 2nd of 1919 he suffered a very severe paralytic stroke with all the usual symptoms of stroke. So basically, he lost mobility on the left side of his body, the left side of his face drooped, and for a while he totally lost the ability to speak. And so his wife, the First Lady Edith Galt Wilson, for a period of time was very important in terms of keeping the business of the federal government going from the White House. It's interesting that the American people didn't realize the seriousness of what had happened because in those days the newspapers didn't try to dig up all the dirt they could on the president, and so they kept it more or less a secret. Slowly, Wilson recovered, at least to the point where he was able to participate in politics, he was able to speak again. But in a way, the stroke brought out the worst side of Wilson's personality even more strongly. His stubbornness, his belief that he was always right and everybody else was wrong. And so when Republicans tried to negotiate with Wilson and work out some kind of compromise over the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson dug in his heels and just refused to talk to them. He told one senator who came to see him, quote, anyone who opposes me in that, meaning the treaty, I'll crush. End quote. Now, the Republicans offered Wilson a pretty good deal. They said they would ratify the treaty and even join the League of Nations if Wilson agreed to certain reservations they had. In other words, they wanted to just add in some loopholes, saying, for instance, that the U.S. would never go to war without congressional approval because of the League. But Wilson absolutely refused to compromise. And as a result, the Senate voted down the Treaty of Versailles, and actually the United States never joined the League of Nations, even though it was really the brainchild of our president, Woodrow Wilson. We never joined. And I really think of this as the tragedy of Woodrow Wilson in a way. In spite of his racism, he he was a very progressive individual who had a lot of very noble ideas, but ultimately his character flaws prevented him from realizing his ultimate dream. And you have to wonder what would have happened if the U.S. had joined the League in the run up to World War II. With our prestige and power in the League, maybe is it possible that Hitler could have been stopped before World War II broke out? It's something interesting to think about. Well, obviously in 1920, Wilson was in no shape to run for re-election, and so he stepped down. But as he left the White House, he made an appeal to voters to vote Democratic so that a new Congress would ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. But the results of that election will have to wait until the next lecture.